Hey guys, welcome back to BanQu's regulatory deep dives. Today we're going to be chatting about the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, otherwise known as the CSRD. Quick reminder that if you want to get updated when we publish new videos about this topic, other similar topics, feel free to subscribe to our channel. And follow us on LinkedIn. We're pretty active on LinkedIn and share not only the videos from YouTube that we've been posting, but also helpful resources and guides and articles, etc., etc. So, and also if you have any, feedback, questions, suggestions, always feel free to reach out via a comment on one of our videos or a message on LinkedIn. So let's get into it. So we'll kind of go over how we typically go over different regulations. We'll start with a quick overview of the CSRD, what the requirements of it are, which companies are actually in scope for the CSRD, what the consequences for noncompliance are, and then the timeline around implementation. We'll also look at what are the differences in the relationship between the CSRD and the NFRD, and then the CSRD and the CSDDD. There's a lot of acronyms when it comes to regulations, because who wants to have to say Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive every single time? But then it can also get confusing. So we're going to go through some other typical ones that are either confused with CSRD, like the CSDDD, or the NFRD, which is basically the predecessor of the CSRD. And then we'll go over some CSRD resources. So in addition to obviously following BanQ's LinkedIn page and our YouTube, there are some other really stellar CSRD resources out there that can help you stay up to date on the latest developments and requirements. And then last but certainly not least, we will chat about BanQu for CSRD. So where BanQu fits in the sea of CSRD solutions out there, and just kind of give you a quick high-level overview. That way, in the chance that you, your team, your company are looking for some support with the CSRD, we can give you a little taste of how BanQu helps out with that, and then you can decide whether or not it's a good fit. Again, you can always reach out and find out more. So let's dive in. So the CSRD stands for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It is an EU regulation that aims to enhance transparency and sustainability reporting among companies. I would say in addition to transparency, it also aims to really standardize and streamline the way that companies report on their sustainability initiatives. Because in, the past years, I think we've seen more direction toward standardized sustainability reporting, but for a lot of the, history of sustainability initiatives, it's kind of been a free-for-all. So this is an attempt to really standardize, regulate, and enhance that transparency. The CSRD will extend and ultimately replace the NFRD to ensure that businesses disclose relevant environmental and social impact information. So it kind of builds upon it. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the CSRD versus the NFRD section, but that's just a good note to be aware of. Which companies are in scope? So it is all large companies with 250 employees and or 400 million euros in turnover and or 20 million euros in total assets listed. This goes for companies placing products doing business within the EU. And again, we're going to get into that a little more deeply in a second. I will say, similar to our other deep dives, this one is very text heavy. We have a lot of really cool screenshots, timelines, side-by-sides. So if there's anything you're like, I want to keep this for a cheat sheet later, please screenshot it. As we don't share the links to the PowerPoints. The rollout of the CSRD and implementation phase starts in 2024. and then it's a phased implementation. And that is very dependent on the types of companies that it will affect. So it kind of starts with like the largest EU companies first, et cetera, rolls out to smaller than medium than smaller listed companies, and then companies that have a big enough presence in the EU that might not necessarily be EU companies, but they also have to comply with this. So again, we'll get into that in a second. We have a really cool timeline graphic that we pulled from a resource that we'll also give credit to in the description. Requirements for the CSRD. This is where it gets pretty fun. But it's the NFRD plus additional requirements. You'll have to conduct a double materiality assessment, which essentially looks at the effects of your operations on the environment and people. You'll need to note your long-term ESG objectives. You'll also have to show supply chain due diligence. And sometimes people refer to that as intangibles, depending on what you're reading. And that's basically like social, human, labor impacts. You will have to closely follow EU taxonomy regulations, which essentially outline like, hey, these are the standards for measuring sustainability, reporting on sustainability. And there will be very strict reporting standards and also mandatory external assurance, such as an audit, that will happen. So again, the rollout is going to be long, phased, and slow, and very doable, but there are a lot of requirements when it comes to reporting on your sustainability throughout your operations. Ultimately, if you do not comply, you could be fined. So say you don't comply, or there's an audit that finds holes in your reporting, you'll be fined. Depending on the member state will determine the legal action. And it could also include, doesn't have to, but public denunciation, order to change conduct, and further financial punishment. So again, will kind of depend on the member state country, but just, keep an eye out for that. Okay. Here's a quick snapshot of NFRD versus CSRD. So what is the NFRD? It's the predecessor of CSRD. Basically what you need to know from here, again, screenshot it if you need it, but it really focuses on environmental and social responsibility, whereas the CSRD builds off of the NFRD, and it looks at that concept of double materiality. So looking at both the impact of society and the environment and the sustainability risk the company experiences. So you have to look at kind of both sides of that coin. Again, long-term ESG objectives, due diligence. So like, how are there fair and equal practices throughout your supply chain operations? You cannot forget about the intangibles, is what they're calling it, like social, human, intellectual capital. And then again, reporting has to be in line with SFRD, EU taxonomy regulation, et cetera, et cetera. Basically just means that it has to follow those standards, which a lot of people are already familiar with. And then again, be audit ready. The reporting format will be very specific, and there will be kind of like a database site where your reports will be uploaded, and more information to come on that in the future. I really love this slide and the next slide. I think it provides some further insights into the CSRD. But this is where we look even more closely at who the in-scope companies are, what the criteria for in-scope companies is, and then also how does that get phased in. So they have, large undertakings. So those are like an EU company or an EU subsidiary in scope, and it has to meet 2 of those 3 criteria, which we've talked about already, but here's another snapshot. And then third country undertaking is either an EU subsidiary that meets the criteria above, or it's a global national company that has an EU branch with $40 million in revenue. And this is in the 2 most recent years. So if it's like a much smaller company now, but used to be bigger, et cetera, et cetera. So keep that in mind, and then you'll see on the right-hand side that the phasing in of required CSRD reporting depends on how big the company is and whether the company is like really large in the EU or an EU company. So, the entities that have already been subject to the NFRD will report in 2025 on the financial year of 2024. So we're in it right now. Those large undertakings will be the year after. The year after will count. They'll report in 2026. And then so on and so forth to small and medium-sized companies, and then those third country undertakings. So even if you're like, I got time, I don't think I'm going to have to report until 2027 or 2029. It can't hurt to start scoping this out, and a lot of companies are already doing so, or planning their headcount to make sure they have, if they don't already, some sort of sustainability reporting expert or supply chain due diligence expert, et cetera, who can tackle not only the CSRD, but all these other regulations that we're seeing pop up. So regardless of where you see yourself in this timeline, you got to start thinking about it. Also really love this timeline image. Again, we will, give credit where credit is due in our description. But this is just another look at that phased in period and kind of how the CSRD really relates to what the EU has been doing with like coming out with the taxonomy criteria of like, this is how you report sustainability standards, the ESRS, which is also another standard for reporting on sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think these two in particular are really lovely visualizations of kind of the phasing, implementation, and the building blocks for the CSRD. Now, CSRD versus CSDDD, not twins, but siblings, perhaps. The CSRD, which we're talking about today, the focus is very much on sustainability reporting. The adoption, again, it was adopted in early 2023, but as we saw, the first reports will be due for those big EU companies next month who are subject to the NFRD. And then those first reports will be due January 2025. And then it really follows closely the ESRS reporting standards, EU taxonomy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the CSDDD instead is very focused on supply chain due diligence. So it's like, okay, throughout your supply chain operations, end to end, what are the effects on the environment? How are humans treated and paid within your supply chain operations? The implementation timeline is similar, but not exact. And then the guidelines are to be released. Now, both share a few key aspects as well. Both of them affect EU and non-EU companies that operate within the EU. So if you're listening to this or you've heard of these things and you're like, you know what, I'm an American company, no big deal, but you've been placing products within the EU market, you need to take a look and make sure to know whether or not you're going to be affected, because the likelihood if your revenue is big enough, you will be. There are financial penalties for non-compliance for both. And then again, like similar frameworks can apply to both. So like reporting standards, sustainability, reporting and data standards will apply to both. Now, there's a lot to keep up with these days, not just on CSRD, but everything we've talked about. Again, in addition to following BanQu and reaching out if you have any questions, these are some resources that our teams have found to be super helpful, just in addition to their own, research and our own internal trainings. But there's a CSRD reporting group on LinkedIn that can be quite nice. But if you only choose to do one thing or follow one person, Daniel has done a really great job with Atlas Zero. So following Atlas Zero and Daniel, I screenshotted his profile here. Hope that's okay with him. I think it is. But he constantly is interviewing experts on the CSRD. He has a whole list of CSRD solutions, including BanQu, that you can choose from and to see which could be the best to help you with your CSRD reporting and compliance, and also a ton of resources just to learn more about the CSRD and the EU regulatory landscape in general. And he's based in Germany, which I think is really nice to just have kind of an inside man. So that's what we suggest, in addition to, of course, following BanQu. And then last but certainly not least, if you are considering BanQu as a CSRD partner, here are some things to know. We can help with double materiality, supply chain, and those intangibles of like social environmental metrics. Now, BanQu is a supply chain traceability solution, as many of you know, which can certainly be, that end-to-end visibility, source to shelf. It can also be we can kind of help out with those portions of your supply chain that are a little more invisible and hard to reach. So say you have a fabulous ERP system, you are really familiar with, your suppliers, manufacturers, but you need to get deeper in order to comply or really level up your supply chain resilience. Like BanQu can also help with that. So we have a lot of out-of-the-box solutions. We also do a lot of like custom work because, as everyone is very familiar, no two supply chains are exactly alike. And so just a couple differentiators of BanQu. We can get you that source level data. You can capture that on the ground data that can help with compliance. We offer asset traceability, so you can trace exactly where those materials originate, but also where they go throughout the chain of custody, and always tie it back to that proof of provenance. We can, tackle capturing sustainability metrics, so social environmental metrics needed to ensure your impact and back up or validate any sustainability claims or CSRD reports, for example. And then again, compliance reporting. So whether you are looking to comply with CSRD, EUDR, CSDDD, or just to mitigate risk and you really want to be better about like engaging with your suppliers and digitizing your supply chain, BanQu can help. So there's a lot that BanQu can do. Here's a little teaser. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to answer those questions. And thank you so much. Again, if you have any feedback or questions, feel free to comment on the video or reach out on LinkedIn. My name is Jordan Wilson and I work at BanQu.